What's the inspiration behind James McBride's new novel? He'll join us in the studio to discuss Deacon King Kong. And how does Rebecca Solnit approach writing memoir? She'll be here to talk about her new book, Recollections of My Nonexistence. Alexandra Alter will give us an update from the publishing world. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. It's March 6th, and I'm Pamela Paul. James McBride is here now. He was last here for his last novel in 2013, The Good Lord Bird. In between, there was a short story collection, 5 Carat Soul. And his new novel is Deacon King Kong. James, thanks so much for being here.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for having me.
All right, so I mentioned this in the introduction. Your last book was a story collection. Before that, The Good Lord Bird came out in 2013. So it's been 7 years since you've had a novel. People have been waiting. They're very excited. How do those 7 years in between work? Are you writing the novel at the same time that you're working on the short fiction, or did you kind of wait to finish that collection before you started work on this?
Well, you always have 4 or 5 things rolling at the same time. Some of the short fiction was stuff that I'd written years and years ago, and some of it was new. This story I'd been cooking in my conscience for some time. And as soon as I got the short story done, I just said, I was feeling this. So I just, pushed in hard. And you're always waiting for the magic to happen, and it kind of started up, and then I just followed the muse,
All right, I'm going to ask you a question about the magic, hopefully not demystifying all of it. But how do you work as a writer during the day? Are you a morning writer? Do you write late at night? Do you give yourself goalposts of 1,000 words a day? Or what's your process like?
Well, what I do is I read a lot. I fill myself up with information before I write. I go to the library. I'm just fill it up until I can just almost like I'm ready to purge, and then I just get up at 4 a.m. and I start writing.
4 a.m?
Yeah, but I go to bed early. I go to bed 8:30. I get up at 4, feed the cat, do a little bit of exercise, and then I just go at it.
How long can you sit and write when you're up at 4?
Well, usually I go till about 7:30. Then I make my son breakfast. I send him out to school. Then after he goes, I hit it for another hour or so, and that's it.
But you're also a musician, and I take it sometimes you're playing later than 8 o'clock at night.
That used to be the case, and it will be the case once again when he goes to college in the fall. But most of my music these days is teaching kids in the church, and that happens during the day. They're not going to have no 2 o'clock in the morning hanging out at New Brown Memorial Baptist Church. I can tell you that right now.
That leads me right into the novel, because a lot of your novel, your main character, Cuffy Jasper Lambkin or Sport Coat, is a church deacon. And this is a little bit about the church, right? Is this coming from personal experience?
Some of it, yeah. I think the church is very funny, but I think it's funny in a really healthy way. Not like, the stereotypical goofy big black mama with the wigs. You better stop that. I don't. I mean, it's funny, and it's a lot deeper than that. But yeah, I think the church is I've had a lot of fun at church. The church is kind of a dysfunctional family, but your family, even though it's dysfunctional. So, you might be dealing with someone who's really weird, bizarre, but you kind of accept them for who, because you just have to. They go to your church. And so that made this book a lot easier for me to do, because I understand the relationships that happen in church.
You talked earlier about doing research, and with The Good Lord Bird, which was set in the 19th century, there was, I imagine, quite a bit of historical research to be done. This is also, I guess, a historical novel in that it's like the late 60s, although it's a little odd that that's now historical, but I guess it is.
Unfortunately, that's the truth. It is, especially when you see what New York is like now as compared to then. This is the 1969 New York, the New York of the New York Mets, pre-cell phone, pre-crack, the Mayor John Lindsay era. John Lindsay was a Republican. He was very polite and he was a well-meaning man.
A different kind of Republican.
Oh, absolutely. It's not like the Republicans now. I mean, let's not waste good air talking about them, but he was a good person. But in any case, the city was a lot different. And we were forced to get along because we all had to take the subway. We all had to take the bus. Manhattan was the land of the super rich. It was working class people, all on the Upper West Side, all the way from Harlem, all the way down to Lower East Side. The only really rich people were supposedly on the Upper East Side. And who knew? Because you never went over there anyway.
And this is in Brooklyn, so this isn't a very
This takes
different
place
New York.
in Brooklyn. Yeah, well, Brooklyn is its own country almost. Many a writer has tried to write about New York, and many a writer has not done it successfully. So I kept my story small. It's just about a church. It's just about a housing project. It's just about the people that live within that 4 or 5 block radius.
What do you think other novelists, and you don't have to get specific unless they're dead maybe, have gotten wrong about New York and about Brooklyn?
I don't think it matters who you are or even what you write about. I think it matters the perspective that you take. I love Brooklyn and I love the church, even though the church is ridiculously stupid. I mean, really, the black church is just, the death extravaganzas, the homophobia. I mean, a lot of it is just like pathetically bad. But it's the only jalopy rolling. So I'm going to jump in that car because that's the only one that's going to go from one side of town to the other for me. It's easier to do that than to just quit it and say, I'm not going to, So I write from the perspective of love for this institution that is in a borough, which during that time was simply called they used to call Miami Beach Brooklyn with palm trees, because there were so many black and Spanish people around. I remember someone said that on the radio when I was a kid. I don't know if it was Miami Beach or somewhere in Florida, So Brooklyn was the dark continent. It's like going back to the jungle. You had East New York and Bed-Stuy. People were and then the working class were fleeing as fast as they could, but not all of them left. And so you had this smorgasbord of Irish Americans, Italian Americans, Spanish-speaking people, and African Americans with a smattering of every other kind. It made Brooklyn a lot of fun.
Did you have to research Brooklyn of that period?
I did, a little bit, even though I'm from Brooklyn myself. Yeah, I did. You'd be surprised what you don't know. Robert Caro, the great Robert Caro, is probably the most important writer. He's got to be one of the top 5 most important writers in New York history. Really, Robert Caro is just a bad dude. Yeah. He is just a bad dude.
So you reread The Power Broker.
I reread The Power Broker. I read it when I was at Columbia. When I went to graduate school at Columbia, they made us read it over the summer. It's even better the second time around. But it really showed how Robert Moses really destroyed a lot of Brooklyn and a lot of the Bronx, and anywhere he touched.
With the road construction and the parks.
Yeah, because he just dropped highways.
Yeah,
I mean, God bless the people in Brooklyn Heights who fought him off. Because Brooklyn Heights remains now one of the most beautiful sections of Brooklyn. They fought him tooth and nail, and they won. But in Red Hook, for example, that BQE, it just goes right through the heart of a lot of Red Hook. It just slices, his highway sliced New York to bits. So it was fascinating to read about how New York evolved and changed during Moses' time, which was, some of that was during the 60s.
You chose in this novel to refer to the area where most of the book takes place. You refer to it as South Brooklyn, as opposed to Red Hook. I mean, is that a way to distance it slightly?
Yeah, because see, the cause houses that takes place, that's the name of the housing project. Red Hook inspired this place, but physically in my mind it was different than the actual Red Hook. There was a lot more accessibility between communities. Red Hook is really, the projects itself are just, dropped in the middle of these single-family homes and surrounded by, 2 or maybe, 5 or 6 blocks away from real houses. Mm-hmm. I brought all those real houses closer so that, you could walk 1 or 2 blocks to get to the Italian section. And you could walk 1 or 2 blocks to get to where the Irish cop grew up. So I condensed and squeezed it closer, and I got the church closer to the freight car where all this stuff happens. And so I had to move some stuff around in my mind. And then, I draw a little map of the place. And so then it becomes that. And then the colors come and the characters arrive. So even though it's sort of inspired by Red Hook, it's really the cause houses in South Brooklyn.
It must be freeing to be able to just draw your own map and change parts around. And then as you write, perhaps change it in order to fit the story. Or did you stick to your original map?
You can do that, but if you do it wrong or you do it too freely, the characters lose air. The air goes out the balloon, the thing dies.
There are a lot of characters in this book, and they all have really great names. I'm just going to list some of them, and then we can talk about them in particular. We already mentioned the main character, Sportcoat, whose real name is Cuffy Jasper Lambkin. And then you've got Deems Clemens, Porkchop, Butch Moon, Thomas the Elephant Elefante, Soup, Potts Mullen, it's a cop name. Where do these people come from in your imagination? And I'm curious about the naming. I mean, it sounds like you had fun with that.
Well, I did. Well, first of all, most of your ethnic groups, and you have to be careful when you say ethnic group. What do you mean? But if you just look into what Irish people call each other, it's very funny. And the same thing with black folks. I mean, I used to know a guy named Aki. What kind of name is that? The old names are better. I don't like the new names, Traquan and, Kwanishi and all this crap that people just make. They make it up. Some of the old stuff seems better because a lot of it's based on actual action.
Did you have a nickname?
Yeah, I had two. My nickname in college was Brittles, and my nickname after school was Cuddy.
All right, you have to explain the origin of those names.
Well, Brittles was because in the summer before I got to school, before I got to Oberlin, I went to Europe with this band, and one of the trumpet players started calling me McBrittles. And then when I got to Oberlin, I just thought it was cool, Brittles. So you
got rid of the Mick?
Yeah, I got the Mick out of there. And then Cuddy, I used to work with a singer named Rochelle Farrell, she's a wonderful jazz singer, and she started calling me Cuddy, which is kind of short for cousin. So when I started playing in New York, a lot of the musicians here knew me or know me as Cuddy.
Is music an influence on each piece of writing you do? Was there music you listened to while you were working on this or that inspired?
No, but I've been heavy into gospel music, for the last few years because I teach it and I write in one room and then there's a piano in the next room. So I'll write and then I'll go to the piano and I'll just monkey around and I'll just play like I'm trying to learn how to play the Lord's Prayer and Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. And I'm trying to learn how to play it in a really hip way. So I'll just try it like a whole bunch of different ways. And then I'll go back and write some more. And that kind of helps me a little bit.
Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be
Let's talk about story. We've talked a little bit about the character, a little bit about the setting. What's the book about?
Essentially, the book is about a deacon named Sportcoat, his nickname is Deacon King Kong because that's the kind of rot gut he likes to drink. He gets drunk one day, he pulls out his old .38 caliber, and he shoots the worst drug dealer in the projects. And so the whole book just pushes out into the neighborhood as a result of this attempted murder of this once promising baseball player who's now the most feared and fearsome drug dealer in the project. So through that one act, which happens right away at the beginning of the book, we see the whole neighborhood and how the waves from this wash over the entire neighborhood, not just the projects, but into the white areas around the projects.
So this is a story that has all of the elements of tragedy, but you inject it with a lot of comedy and farce. And is that the natural mood that you like to write in? How did you land on that?
Well, I don't know. My mother's Jewish. Jewish people are funny. I don't know.
The Irish are funny. The Jews are funny.
Everybody's look. It's just it depends on your perspective. I think that humor is a really good way to make people listen to you, and it also gives people room to say, "I made a mistake. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I made a mistake." So I just couldn't write a book that says, that's just so serious and blood's gushing out. And why read a book if you can't have fun? Why take the reader into a book if they can't get some relief from their world,
All right, speaking of fun, your last novel, The Good Lord Bird, is being turned into a TV series, miniseries, right, by Showtime,
right,
starring Daveed Diggs and Ethan Hawke. I'm sure many others. What's that been like? Are you involved at all in that?
You're talking about my man. That's my man. No. I was involved with Ethan when him and his wife, they first got involved in the project. Ethan's a writer, so he really understands story. He did a magnificent job. He just cashed in all his chips to make this thing. And it's really great. It's great.
So he wrote it?
He wrote the original script. Then Showtime hired a showrunner named Mark Richard, who was very experienced and very good. And he broke it out into 7 or 8 episodes, and he hired a team of 5 or 6 scriptwriters who went through it. And lengthened it and pushed it out and did this and that and the other to make it into a 7-part or 8-part miniseries.
And were you a consultant? Were you in the writer's room, or there was like stay away?
I was just the guy I stayed away. I was just the guy who showed up on the set every once in a while, and they treated me like so nice, like, oh, the writer's here. Oh, you want some more potato chips? I mean, it was great, So I visited the set a couple times, but I stayed out of their way because, they knew what they were doing. I really enjoyed working with Ethan. I really did. And Mark Rashad as well. I thought that they did a magnificent job, and I can't wait till it comes out.
All right, I'm going to bring up politics peripherally one last time, but an exciting part of politics, which is that you got a National Humanities Medal. You were awarded one by President Obama. What was that like?
That was great. It was just before he left office, and, it was just a powerful moment. And, he did, like, what he does is, like, he reads like, hear ye, da-da-da-da. And then you go up to him and he shakes your hand. So he only spoke 3 words to me. He said, I appreciate you. Yeah, I thought that was cool.
Those are a good 3 words.
I appreciate you. So, it was great. I sat next to Terry Gross, who got one as well. Barry Gordy got one. And Mel Brooks got one. He was delightful.
That was your class.
Yeah, that was my class. Yeah, well, that was when the White House was worth visiting. And it'll be worth visiting again.
All right. I will end with the same 3 words. They won't have the same impact as when uttered by President Obama. But I appreciate you. Thanks for coming on, James.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be back.
James McBride's newest book is called Deacon King Kong. So here's a request for our listeners. I get lots of feedback from you, some complaints, lots of kind words. Really appreciate it. You can always reach me directly at books@nytimes.com. I will write back. But you can also, if you feel moved to do so, review us on any platform where you download the podcast, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or somewhere else. Please feel free to review us and, of course, email us at any time. Before we continue, I make many mistakes in my life and sometimes even on this podcast, and I really want to correct 2 of them. One I made a few weeks ago, and it's been troubling me ever since. I was talking about a book called The Hazelwood and about its sequel, The Night Country, but I actually didn't refer to the original as The Hazelwood. So there you have it. The book is called The Hazelwood. It's by Melissa Albert. The other correction comes in from a listener. Her name is Joy Hecht, and she wrote, "Hi, folks. I was just listening to the February 7th podcast in which you mentioned 2 Manhattan bookstores, Book Culture and The Strand. You said, rather to my horror, that Book Culture had gone out of business. This could not be further from the truth. The Columbus Avenue branch of Book Culture has closed due to their rent increases, but there are 2 branches in my neighborhood on 112th Street of Broadway and on 113th Street in Broadway are certainly going strong. I most sincerely hope you will correct this terrible error on your podcast, both out of respect for the owners of this wonderful store and so that other New Yorkers will not think that yet another independent bookstore might be lost unbeknownst to us." So there we go. I'm correcting this terrible error. Very sorry for making that mistake. There are still 2 branches of Book Culture that readers can visit.
One day long ago, I looked at myself as I faced a full-length mirror and saw my image darken and soften and then seem to retreat, as though I was vanishing from the world, rather than that my mind was shutting it out. I steadied myself on the doorframe just across the hall from the mirror, and then my legs crumpled under me. My own image drifted away from me into darkness, as though I was only a ghost fading even from my own sight. I blacked out occasionally and had dizzy spells often in those days, but this time was memorable because it appeared as though it wasn't that the world was vanishing from my consciousness, but that I was vanishing from the world. I was the person who was vanishing and the disembodied person watching her from a distance, both and neither. In those days I was trying to disappear and to appear, trying to be safe and to be someone, and those agendas were often at odds with each other. And I was watching myself to see if I could read in the mirror what I could be and whether I was good enough, and whether all the things I'd been told about myself were true.
That was Rebecca Solnit reading from the opening pages of her new memoir, Recollections of My Nonexistence. Rebecca joins us now from San Francisco. Thanks for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you.
I wanted to start with that passage because it's an interesting choice to open a memoir. It's not in a fixed place in time, but perhaps you can talk a little bit about why you chose to open your book this way and what was going on at that time.
That was a small incident when I was at the end of my teens or my early 20s, living in a little apartment in a Black neighborhood in San Francisco, really poor, really struggling to try and build some kind of future for myself, and really impacted by gender violence, violence against women all around me, manifesting as menace and harassment on the streets, but all kinds of other things as well. And it felt like to survive that menace, I was always being advised of ways to withdraw from fully participating, fully being present, fully being free, fully being vocal. And that there was just this terrible tension between wanting to be a participant, wanting to have a voice, wanting to be free, and wanting to survive. There were two forms of non-existence facing me, thus the title of the book, Recollections of My Nonexistence. And this paragraph, which also touches on the double consciousness W.E.B. Du Bois talked about for Black people, John Berger talked about for women, seemed to describe that more than anything else I could begin with, that sense of literally disappearing, but also that sense of being distant from yourself, of watching yourself as though you were someone else. And literally seeing myself disappear just seemed to be the right point of departure for everything that would follow.
These themes that you write about in these two paragraphs and that you're talking about, themes about women, about violence against women, about identity, are themes that you've explored in many ways, many formats in many of your many other books, mostly in the form of essays, but also in reported nonfiction. What made you decide to write a memoir?
I felt like I'd fallen into a trap of talking in a confident, objective voice that left out something that's really important. What does it actually do to you to live in a world where a lot of people would like to murder you and a lot of people denies that's real and has an impact? And a lot of culture celebrates and eroticizes that violence. And for me, as a really young woman, it became so overwhelming and so traumatic that I really had a lot of classic PTSD symptoms, not because of any one terrible thing that happened to me, but because I felt like I was living in a war, and a war that nobody wanted to declare. So there's also a kind of gaslighting about being told that these things didn't matter, they weren't happening. If they were happening, it was on me for not making the right choices and not doing all the fun and appropriate things I should do in response to lots of people wanting to harm me. So I really wanted to convey the subjective, emotional, psychic inner life of living in these conditions. And there's a wonderful sentence Henry David Thoreau has, I think somewhere in Walden, where he says, "I would not write about myself so much. Did I know anyone else so well?" And in some sense, this is a book about a very specific experience of becoming a writer and acquiring a voice, and a voice to talk about these things in the world at large, but also about the ordinary condition of voicelessness and vulnerability that I think impacts most or all women.
Did you think of this as an intellectual memoir, kind of interior memoir, more so than a life memoir, meaning events unfolding one after the other in a chronology?
I think I'm incapable of writing that kind of book. I've often been told or asked if I was going to write a novel, with the implication that novels are the highest form of literature, and surely I aspire to climb. And I joke that I'm not much for characters, plot, and dialogue, so there's that. I wouldn't call it an intellectual memoir, but it's a memoir trying to track a few specific themes. What is the experience of voicelessness? How is having a voice central to being a citizen, a member of a society, a person with power, a person with rights? How does becoming a writer just formalize the business we all engage in of creating a self who is a participant, who belongs, who's a member, who has something to say, and who knows what her values and politics and positions are. And so it's not a memoir about my family, which I've written about in other memoir-like books, including The Faraway Nearby in 2013. I actually wrote a chapter about the lovely man I was with for a lot of my 20s and then dropped it because it felt gratuitous. And I just really wanted to home in on this question of how do you form yourself as a person? How do you appear in circumstances in which so much tells you to disappear or threatens you with disappearance? So it's intellectual in that it's focused on intellectual questions, but it's not intellectual because I think those experiences are so emotional and so personal.
And every memoir, of course, is very personal and sort of stands on its own. But were there memoirs that you had read, that you admired, that you thought of as, I would love to do something like this, but with my life, with my ideas? Did you have models?
It's funny. It's really more books I read afterwards, including Ocean Vuong's novel that feels in some ways like a memoir, On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, and Carmen Maria Machado's In the Dream House, that made me wish I'd done something different. They're both such exquisite and particular and detailed, poetic descriptions of experience. I think this book is more abstract in that I wanted to describe what happened to me in the context of what happens to the category of people like me, female people, and then extend beyond it into the other kinds of non-existence that informed and shaped me living in a Black neighborhood and seeing gentrification and racism, structural racism take place, living next to a gay neighborhood and seeing homophobia and the AIDS crisis unfold, joining a Native American land rights movement, and coming to understand the genocide facing Native people as a crisis of representation as well as literal genocide. So I was doing something really different, and it felt more essayistic than what memoirs normally do, in which, they more resemble novels that cleave pretty closely to the events in your own life and your personal experiences. In some ways, I thought of it as an anti-memoir, because so often memoirs are framed as what happens to you is personal, and you can overcome it through personal means. You leave your abuser, you heal your formative wounds, you transform yourself to become strong where you were weak, or to understand something that was incomprehensibly awful. And something I say pretty directly in this book is that I felt there was no personal adjustment or transformation I could make, because the thing I was confronting wasn't personal, and it wasn't something I should either accept and adjust to, or something that I could leave behind because it was systemic, and because so much of what impacted me wasn't just things happening to me, but happening to the people around me, the domestic violence in my mother's marriage, the near murder of the friend who gave me the desk on which I wrote this book and all my other books, and so much more around me, including in what I read without even seeking it out in the news every day.
Let's talk about that setting of your opening scene and the end of much of your memoir, which was San Francisco during a very different period. What was the neighborhood you lived in? When was this exactly? And what was San Francisco like? Because that is really a city that has transformed radically in so many ways since this period that you're describing.
Yeah, I grew up in the Bay Area and moved to San Francisco in 1980, and I joke that I've lived in 10 different cities named San Francisco, and the current one is my least favorite. The San Francisco I moved into in 1980 was like so many other cities in that era, not yet gentrified, a lot of industrial ruin that had not been cleaned up and replaced by the new financialization and information economies spread all around me. And it felt like a freer place, a place where people had more choices about how to live because you could be idealistic, live off a part-time job and work as an activist or try to become a poet or any number of other things. It was a more diverse city economically and in some ways ethnically, and California is far more Latino, but it was a city with a much higher Black population. And it was just a city that felt more magical, more enchanting because of the ruins, because of the freedom and eccentricity that flourished that would eventually be gentrified out. And I moved into a beautiful apartment made possible for me by the building manager of this 7-unit building. And I lived there for 25 years, which also made me stay still long enough to see the change all around me and to start to understand how hard it is to see change if you're changing and moving around yourself. So I saw the city change in so many ways. And living in a city was so much what taught me and enriched my life. We often speak about experiences as though they only affect you if you're in that category, as though homophobia or gay liberation only affects you if you're gay. But one of the things I write about in this book is how much I learned from gay men, how much joy there was in being friends and conversing with them, how much they invited me to reject gender norms because if they could reject them, I could too. And living in an incredibly diverse non-white majority city in which it felt like there was no one norm of how to be was also a beautiful invitation to flourish and to flourish in eccentricity and to choose my own path that I think cities really offered then do much less now that so many cities have been impacted by the reversal of post-war white flight, now that they're so expensive to live in that so many young people have to work full-time, often at a corporate job just to be there. Now that the economics of idealism about being a poet, a human rights activist, somebody experimental, all that seems so much harder to come by. So I wanted to convey, particularly to young readers, what cities could be at that moment in time, that maybe they're not so much now. Some cities still are the cities that are still more affordable, more diverse, but not San Francisco anymore.
I have one more question for you, and it's about those younger readers and new generation of readers, many of whom I think have probably come through your work originally with your 2008 essay, Men Explain Things to Me. And I'd love for you to just talk a little bit about that essay, about the impact it has. And I imagine that as you go around reading and speaking, that you hear a lot of young people asking about it, coming up to you, having been galvanized by that piece.
Yeah, that essay has had such an extraordinary life. I couldn't have anticipated when I wrote it one morning at a friend's bidding in March of 2008. And what's striking for me going back to it and looking at the circumstances of its creation and what it's really saying is how much it's what I've been expanding on in the last several years of writing more and more about feminism, about centering the conversation on voice, on what it means to be inaudible or treated as a person who lacks credibility, or being treated as though people actually hear you and maybe they believe you, but it doesn't matter because there are no consequences anyway. That was an essay not just about men explaining things to you, but that men explaining something they don't understand and you do, that they're not expert on and you are, as a subsection of a larger realm in which women are treated as incompetent, even about their own experience, even when they're saying something like, he's trying to kill me, which is the lack of credibility that often gets women killed. So I was really trying to convey what it means to not have a voice, what it means to not be heard. And I should say here we say not having a voice, and that's often a misnomer. Women often speak up, which is the power they have, but the power of choosing to listen to them, to believe them, to act on what they say, to take them seriously is not within the speaker's power, but within the listeners and the society's power, and it's often not granted. So one of the joys and insights of writing this book was coming to understand really deeply how much I was writing about what does it mean to have a voice, what my own path was trying to formulate, that professional thing, a writer's voice, but also just trying to have a voice in my own life and to speak up about the condition of voicelessness, particularly as it affects women, but also as it affects other constituencies when they're forced into non-existence, become non-participants, are pushed out of the conversation and the culture.
Given that new readership, this new generation of young readers, what do you hope that they might most glean from this new book, from your memoir?
I hope it becomes part of a conversation both about how violence impacts us, how intimate and personal the psychic toll is, but also what it means to have a voice and how much feminism and women's rights have always been about having a voice and the complexities and nuances and social structures that determine who has a voice and what it means to have a voice. I wanted to take the conversation a little bit further there and to celebrate the extraordinary feminist conversation, so much of it created by younger women of the past several years, that has created a lot more space for that. I think we have a lot to celebrate, even though this process still has so much more to accomplish, even though violence still has so much impact on us. And this book just feels like an attempt to maybe draw the conversation out a little bit further and make space to address some things that I think there's more room to address.
All right. Well, continuing that conversation, the book again is called Recollections of My Nonexistence. It's by Rebecca Solnit. Rebecca, thank you again for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Alexandra Alter joins us now with some news from the literary world. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, Pamela.
What's new?
So when you and I talked a few months ago about some of the most anticipated books of 2020, at the top of my list and many people's list was Hilary Mantel's The Mirror and the Light, which is her conclusion to her trilogy about the life of Thomas Cromwell. And some of us have been looking forward to this book for a decade, more than a decade since the first one, Wolf Hall, was released. The trilogy has been really groundbreaking commercially and culturally. She won 2 Booker Prizes, and, it was adapted into a theater production and a BBC show, and it's really had a huge cultural impact, particularly in the UK, where it's really reshaped perceptions of Tudor history, even impacting academic studies and things like that. So in anticipation of the release of the book, I met with Hilary Mantel at her home in England in a charming town called Budleigh Salterton, which was maybe one of my favorite datelines to ever get on a story. And it was really interesting to talk to her about bringing the series over the finish line, which was quite a feat and really a challenge for her. She has some health issues, and it was really a kind of endurance contest for her. So rather than telling you, everything she told me, I thought it would be interesting for our listeners to hear from her directly since I recorded the interview. So I selected a few key questions and excerpts that I hope will give listeners some insight into her process.
Excellent. Let's hear the first.
So one of the main questions I had, because I was so distraught over the ending of this remarkable series, was what it was like for her kind of emotionally to go through the end of Cromwell's life, which is very tragic. I would say spoiler alert, but because, it's a well-known historical fact, he was beheaded. So I asked her about what it was like to end the series emotionally and whether she missed having Cromwell as her constant companion. And her answer was quite surprising. She told me that she never really felt there was a day that she had to kill him because she actually wrote about Cromwell's beheading, which takes place at the end of the trilogy, shortly after she wrote the opening sequences of Wolf Hall, which depict Cromwell as a young man being beaten by his father.
When I wrote the first lines of the book about Cromwell lying on the floor, his father kicking him, and the fact that he thinks he's going to die in the next few seconds, I knew in a sense I'd written the end. Not that the words had to be exact mirrors, but again, he's lying on the scaffold, and a man is standing over him, a very dangerous man, and he thinks in a few seconds I will be dead. So once I got that, all I had to do was fill in the middle. So the intense emotional work was done very early. I think that when I had to relive it, I was rehearsed. I had to find an effective way of writing it down, but I probably had about 20 goes already at the last page. There wasn't a day when I woke up and thought, today I killed Cromwell, because I'd already killed him and brought him back, several times.
At another point in the interview, I asked her about what particular challenges she faced writing the final book in the trilogy, which took her much longer than she anticipated or her publisher did. And she said part of it was historical, actually. She's done a tremendous amount of research, perhaps as much as a historian would or even more than some historians. And she talked a bit about why this particular period of English history was so complex and why wading through some of the documentation surrounding Cromwell was so difficult.
Cromwell gets to a point where he's in charge of so much, and all the business of the country's coming across his desk. And the historical record thickens up correspondingly. There are so many documents, and so much of the documentation centres around Cromwell. There's hardly a letter or an account of an event that he's not in somewhere. So just from that technical point of view, a huge amount of material to take account of. Whilst, of course, his life, his private thoughts remain as unguessable as ever. But the actual material to be surveyed and then processed is much greater. And it covers 4 very complex years. So part of the reason that it's taken the time it's taken is just this, trying to do a conscientious job and give myself time to reach some reasonable conclusions.
So later on in our conversation, Hillary and I spoke about how when she's done all her research and the facts become almost background knowledge for her, there's another stage of the creative process, which she described to me as feeling like almost live, like watching a play. Her characters start talking and she feels like she's almost taking dictation from them. And sometimes she can't even type fast enough to get their words down, which I found very interesting given how much she bases her material on, the records that she can find. There's this whole other aspect of her imagination sort of almost going beyond what the historical record supports. And sometimes she says she has to restrain herself and not go too far so that she contradicts something. So here's how she described that process.
You come to a point with your character where you feel you know what they'd say or do in any situation. And you don't sit communing with your character, I think, in the abstract. What you do is just pitch them into action. And it means you generate a lot more material than you're going to use, even if it's just in your head and never hits the page. I think that once those voices begin, it's like having the radio on in the background for 15 years. It never actually fades. And of course, they're then more real and solid to you than actual people in your life. Mm-hmm. And that is what gradually fades. And now I'm almost talking for a living. And it feels very frivolous and empty compared to the stillness that there used to be in every day. And more, I think that writing is about listening.
So those were just a few highlights from our conversation. There's more in the profile, which will be in this Sunday's Arts and Leisure section.
All right. Well, Alexandra, thank you so much. And Hillary Mantel from afar, thank you too.
Thanks, Pamela, and thank you, Hillary.
Joining us now to talk about what we're reading, my colleagues Greg Coles, John Williams, and Andrew LaValle. Hey, guys.
Hi, Pamela.
Hey, Pamela.
Greg, let's start with you. What are you reading this week?
Well, you may remember that a few weeks ago I had read Bad Blood by John Carreyrou, which is the Theranos story about Elizabeth Holmes, young woman in Silicon Valley, and how it all went wrong for her and for her company. And so sort of as a follow-up to that, I'm in the middle of a memoir called Uncanny Valley by Anna Wiener, also about a young woman in Silicon Valley where everything goes wrong for her, although in very different ways. Unlike Elizabeth Holmes, who was the head of Theranos and led its epic fraud, Anna Wiener is a small-time player who starts out this book in the publishing industry in New York and hopscotches her way into Silicon Valley almost accidentally. She takes a job at an ebook publisher in Manhattan and then is hired away into Silicon Valley, and it eventually ends up at a company that structures itself on open source coding, which is to say it has no structure at all. And what they're doing, they're like a data gathering company. And so she has this window onto the way that Silicon Valley operates. And the joy of this book is all in the voice. She is a real gimlet-eyed observer of the scene. She is great with details and then at opening those details up to explain what they say about the bigger structure of Silicon Valley and of the world. And there's a lot of gender in here, which is very interesting reading it after the Theranos book, because where Elizabeth Holmes is a clear villain in that book and the clear head of the company, reading Anna Wiener, you really get the picture that Silicon Valley does not have a lot of room for women in it, certainly at the companies that she ends up at. The section I'm reading right now is Anna is attending a conference in Phoenix for women in computing. She says she's not really a woman in computing. She's a woman with a computer. But she is looking forward to talking to some of the engineers from her company at this conference and seeing what it's like for women who are respected for their skills rather than somebody like herself. And she's disconcerted to find out that they're essentially treated no differently than she is, that women feel very sidelined there. So it's Uncanny Valley by Anna Wiener, beautifully written, funny, smart, and a very depressing picture of Silicon Valley and the tech scene in very recent years.
Your second depressing tech book in a row.
Yeah.
What are the uplifting tech books these days? There've got to be a couple. We'll find them.
Yes, a moment of silence as we all contemplate that.
I'm not reading any tech books.
What are you reading, John?
I'm going to talk about two things quickly. I haven't been on the segment in a while, so I thought I would have this incredible list of things to choose from. But of course, I left my house without really thinking about it or looking at my books. So I'm flying by the seat of my pants a little bit. The thing I left at home that I want to talk about is Richard Wright's Black Boy, his memoir from the mid-1940s, which I finished recently, and which recounts his time growing up, sort of split into two halves or kind of like 2/3 and then a final third. The first part of the book is about his upbringing in the South in Mississippi, Arkansas, and Tennessee with his family. And then the last part of the book, he's in Chicago as a slightly older person, and it mostly recounts his time with his experience with the Communist Party there. It's a great book. It's full of flights of great introspection about what it was like growing up in the Jim Crow South in the 1920s. And I'm not someone who – I don't like the sort of dewy-eyed pieces that people write about reading as this, like it makes you a better person. I think that, reading is incredible, but I think you kind of bring to it what you already are in some ways. But I was
Can it make you worse?
Probably, yeah.
It depends what you're reading.
Yeah, I don't think this book will probably make you a little better. But I was so moved by these passages that are untethered to any plot, but they're really just about him describing how he felt as someone who was a reader in his teenage years and starting to understand other people through reading novelistic descriptions of them. And I found myself unexpectedly very moved by that. And there are just all of these moments where he's coming up against racism and expectations in both very obvious and then very not as obvious ways. There's the scene where he's in the backyard with his own uncle. I think it's his uncle or his grandfather. And he's threatening him with, Wright is threatening him with these two razors because he doesn't want him to punish him for something that he thinks is unjust. And so he's saying, he's sticking up for himself in the face of this sort of corporal punishment that doesn't come from anywhere in particular. And then of course there are the white authorities, and people on his jobs, white men who try to keep him down and keep him from exercising what is obviously his great, intelligence and ambition. And then in Chicago, I think it peters out a little bit for me in the last section because similarly actually to Invisible Man, which I read recently, there are these sort of intra-party, very mid-century scenes about like communist ideology and the fallings out within those groups. And it's obviously interesting up to a point, but I don't need dozens and dozens of pages of it, I don't think. The thing I'll mention quickly and secondly, because it's so different and strange, is this very thin novel called The Ice Palace by a Norwegian writer named Tarjei Vesaas. It's Tarjei, and then his last name is Vesaas. AAS. And I forget where I read about this recently, but this is a Penguin Modern Classics edition from the UK that I'm reading. It's funny because Max Porter, who's a British writer, has a quote on the back of the book that says, "I'm surprised it isn't the most famous book in the world." Now, I'm not surprised by that. It's about these two girls, Sis and Un. And Un sort of shows up in the town one day, and Sis becomes kind of obsessed with her. And then Un explores this frozen waterfall area one day alone, and presumably, I'm only halfway through the book, disappears, and you assume she sort of froze to death in this structure. And it's about 130 pages. It's a story that could be told probably in 25 pages, so there's a lot of repetition, a lot of very austere fairy tale-like language about the girl left behind wondering about the fate of her friend. So I'm hoping that there's a big twist, because I think that I'm enjoying it, but it's not the warmest read, and the prose is very kind of blunt and repetitive. I'm waiting to see the fate of these two girls, which could be really interesting. Andrew, what are you reading this week?
I am also reading a classic. I'm reading The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. She's been on my mind a lot since she died last summer, and I have read most of her books, but somehow along the way, I just never got to this one. And one of my New Year's resolutions this year was to fill in some of the gaps in my reading. This is the first novel she wrote. It focuses on an 11-year-old Black girl who yearns to have blue eyes that she thinks will make her as beautiful as other white children in her world. And like a lot of Morrison's books, it's exploring race, and I would say more specifically self-loathing, issues around colorism, and trauma within families. As you come to expect with Morrison, really interesting, beautiful, powerful writing. It is not necessarily a happy ending, but in our pessimistic world, this is what works for me.
Is the 11-year-old narrated, or is it third person?
It goes back and forth. There are times where it's in her voice. You also hear from her parents, and kind of interestingly from these friends of hers who are observing how her life is like breaking down.
Pamela, what are you reading?
I'm doing something unusual for me, which is I'm reading 3 books at a time. Usually I'm a monogamist with my books, and the only time when I deviate from that is if I have a very, very big book. Like when I was reading the 3rd volume of the Robert Caro, I would have a home book and a workbook. But even that kind of broke down, and I ended up carrying that huge Caro around with me because I just get very committed. But in this case, I feel uncommitted to all 3, which isn't to say that I'm not enjoying them all or appreciating them all. But 2 of them at least are books that I feel like I can only take in bits, and I think for good reason. So I'm going to talk only about one of them, but just so you know, the 3 books are the latest book by Emmanuel Carrere, which is called 97,196 Words. We talked about it a little bit on a podcast recently because Barry Guin was reading another book of his. It's not even all essays. Some of it is reportage. It's a real kind of mixed bag, and it's wonderful.
That's a good book to be rotating with others because you can read it in pieces.
You can read it in pieces. It is pieces, and it's so excellent, and I'm probably going to talk about every single piece, but on a later podcast. The other book that I'm reading also in bits is Stony the Road, Reconstruction, White Supremacy, and the Rise of Jim Crow by Henry Louis Gates Jr., and he was on the podcast last year to talk about this and a children's book that he had written around the same time. This is also a book that you can really only take in bits, and I'll talk about in more detail why that is later. It is what it sounds like. One of the reasons I am not carrying it around with me is that it's a very handsomely produced book with a lot of reproductions, and it's an odd thing to say because the reproductions are very terrible bits of propaganda and literature and cartoons from the Jim Crow era. So we're both lately in the Jim Crow era, reading-wise. And the 3rd book I also can only take in bits, and I actually think is best read slowly, and that is Untangled, Guiding Teenage Girls Through the 7 Transitions into Adulthood by Lisa Damour. And this is the one I'll talk about today. I'm not finished with it. One of the reasons I'm reading it slowly is because I want to absorb it every day. It's a really smart book, and it's rare in my experience to find a really smart, well-written, believable, useful parenting book. It so often feels, in my experience, like there are composite characters, the people don't feel real, the conversations that are reconstructed don't feel believable, and it doesn't feel at all practical. And this one is the opposite of all that. Everything about it is believable. Lisa D'Amour is a Yale-educated psychotherapist working in Shaker Heights, and she wrote another book as well that I have not read. Both books, I believe, have been bestsellers, and this is one that has been recommended to me a million times, and I've already started recommending it to everyone I know. I'm like, even if you don't have a teenage girl, like I recommended it to my brother who has an 11-year-old girl. I'm just like, just get ready and prepare. I've recommended it to people with teenage boys because I feel like there are still parallels. It's funny because a subtitle like The 7 Transitions into Adulthood, it felt very guru-like, but it's actually not. I don't even know what the 7 transitions are. I'm reading it a few pages at a time, but it deals with everything from a girl's relationship with herself, with her body, with friendship, with ambition, with peer pressure, and it just kind of goes through it and feels so real and so contemporary. So I read it a few pages at night, but it kind of depends slightly on my current interactions with my own teenage daughter, how much of it I want to read. At a given moment.
When was it originally published?
It was published originally in hardcover in 2016.
Oh, okay. So
but I have to say, I know that does feel very recent, very contemporary, but the world of teenagers is changing so quickly, particularly with technology and pop culture and just all of the issues that are out there that I think teenagers are sort of grappling with probably more directly than many of us middle-aged people who are probably often in avoidance mode, that it still feels up to the moment 4 years later.
Well, I know a couple of 11-year-olds, and it seems to me like they're definitely like at the point that my generation was when we were like 14 or so. It's like teenagerdom feels like it's moving earlier and earlier anyway. So.
Yes, that's the GOY phenomenon, the growing older younger.
Oh God,
it has an acronym, John. John has revealed himself as a non-parent here. But yeah, I feel like, John, read it. It's about you too.
Sure.
Okay, so that's what I'm reading. Let's run down the titles again. Greg?
I'm reading Uncanny Valley, a memoir by Anna Wiener.
I read Black Boy by Richard Wright, and I'm now reading The Ice Palace by Tarhai Visas.
I read The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison.
And I am reading slowly Untangled, Guiding Teenage Girls Through the 7 Transitions into Adulthood by Lisa D'Amour. All right, thanks everyone.
Thanks, Pamela.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.